So how is everyone this morning? Doing good? It is comforting to see faces from last week. I didn't scare anybody off. Or if I did, I'm not aware of them yet, so that's okay. But glad to be here again. We are in our second class in the quarter, and there's our official start bell. But we're in the book of Matthew. So if you want to get your Bibles out, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 2 today. Like I said, I'm glad to see some of you back. I hope I didn't bore too many of you with our talk about genealogies last week. We're gonna get into some more. Oh, I appreciate that. And I did have several very kind comments from many of you, so I do appreciate the feedback. Very, very much appreciated. But today we're going to be in Matthew chapter 2, and we're going to do a story that we should all be very, very familiar with, and it's the story more or less of the wise men and Jesus' birth. Now, to get us kind of thinking this morning, our brains moving. When you think about, and again, I recognize that we're in the middle of September and we're going to talk about Jesus' birth. I know that doesn't sit well with a lot of people, but we're going to do it. We're treading water today. But when you think about the story of Jesus' birth, what comes to mind? Culturally, there's a lot of things that we think about immediately. When Christmas time rolls around, you drive through neighborhoods, you see the nativity scene. There's a lot of things that come to mind. And if I had to guess for most of you, this is an image that comes to mind, something very similar to this. And so I feel like when we have nativity scenes and you're driving around the neighborhoods in the middle of Christmas time, this is kind of what comes to mind. And it's a lot of very similar imagery from most places. You have this little stable. You have Mary and Joseph, and they're kneeling in front of the manger that just happens to be the perfect size for a baby. You have these angels up here, and they're always children. You have a star kind of posted above the stable, and it's got that tail as big as a kite that we sing about, right? In this picture, for some reason, we have camels that have afros. I'm not sure where that one comes from. But you got the wise men there. All the sheep are very diligently looking at the baby. Mary and Joseph have halos, which is fun. Some images you often have sheep have halos, which I don't know the philosophy behind that, but you see that a lot. But more or less, this is what comes to mind for most of the people that we live around in the world. And we have an account from the book of Matthew, which we're going to study today. And it's in Matthew chapter 2. Matthew's account, more or less, and this is a very high-level summary, but you have magi that travel from a faraway land to visit the Messiah. King Herod hears about this, and he's very troubled. The magi find Jesus in Bethlehem, and they present him with gifts. And then, in response to this, Herod issues a decree for all the children all the boys under the age of 2 to be killed. Now, Luke's account, or Luke's gospel, also records a different version of a story. In that version, you have Joseph and a pregnant Mary, and they're traveling from Bethlehem, or traveling to Bethlehem for a census. There's no inns available, so they find a place to give, or she finds a place to give birth and lays him in a manger, and then the shepherds come to visit. Now, the problem is a lot of times these two stories get conflated as being two different versions of the same story. Even in this version, you have magi presenting gifts to Jesus at the manger, which we're going to see today is not necessarily what Matthew's account talked about. But sometimes you'll have images where like the shepherds and the magi are like hanging out together outside the stable. So more or less, we want to get to the bottom of what the real story is. But again, last week we talked a little bit about how it's helpful to have multiple gospel accounts so you can compare them, and when you put them all together, it helps formulate a more in-depth story. But before we get too deep into the text today, I do want to do a little bit of background into two sets of characters that we run into in Matthew's account. And the first one is King Herod. Really interesting guy. A lot of history that's recorded outside of the biblical context, so we know a lot about him from that. But a little bit of backstory, and I hope everyone can see that. If I need to blow up the slides next time, I can do that. But there's this, what we call the intertestament period between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New, about 400 years. The world did not just stop. We just don't have any biblical record of it. So during that time, we have this dynasty that comes about called the Hasmonean dynasty. This is around 140 BC. Like I said, during these 400 years, there's a lot of ebb and flow between who's in charge in Israel. But at this point in time, it's this dynasty known as the Hasmonean dynasty. Fast forward a couple years, and you have 113 BC, and this guy by the name of Antipater is born in Idumea. Now, Antipater is Herod's father. And there's a couple important things to note about this. So Idumea, if you look on my map, I said last week I'm not a map guy. I have two maps in this slide, so bear with me here. But Idumea is down here south of Judea. And this is relevant because Idumea is also known by the name of Edom. So if you'll kind of do your thinking, Idumea would be the descendants of Esau, right? So these are the Edomites, essentially. At this point in time, they're called the Idumeans. So if you remember back in Genesis, you have the story of Jacob and Esau. Jacob's descendants became the nation of Israel. Esau's descendants became Edom, or the Edomites, and currently known as Idumea. So Herod's father is actually born in Idumea, not born a Jew. Then we come to 110 BC, and I should also mention that Herod's father, Antipater's father, was a well-established governor in Idumea. So he comes from a family of high influence, or Antipater did. So then we come to 110 BC, a couple years after Herod's father is born, and a guy by the name of John Hyrcanus I conquers Idumea. So John Hyrcanus was the high priest, and he's the ruler over Israel at this point in time. He's part of this Hasmonean dynasty we talked about. And he gets a little bit on this conquering rampage. So he goes and conquers a bunch of areas around their nation, including Idumea, where a young Antipater is living. And what's interesting about this conquering is that whenever Hyrcanus came in and conquered this area, he did something a little bit unique that would be kind of characteristic at the time. And what he did was he forcibly required that everyone as part of this conquered Idumea, they were forcibly converted to Judaism. You were kind of given a choice, die or convert. And so Herod's family, again, Herod's not born yet, but Antipater and Antipater's whole family are forcibly converted into Judaism. So then we get to 72 BC, a couple decades later, and Herod is born, still living in Idumea. The family is still in Idumea. They're kind of people of high influence, but Herod is born, again, not born a Jew necessarily, but his family had been converted to Judaism. But he is born in Idumea. And at this point in time, Antipater has become a very high-ranking official in the Hasmonean dynasty. Now, if you study anything about Antipater, you'll know that he's one of these guys that his allegiances are kind of wherever the wind's blowing. So at this point in time, he's very diligent allegiance towards the Hasmonean government. So then we get to 63 BC, and a dispute arises between Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. So these two are brothers. I believe they're like nephews of Hyrcanus I, it's my understanding, but they're not his sons, but it's later on down the line. But a dispute arises between Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II over who's going to take over the throne. And this results in what's been referred to as the Hasmonean Civil War. Now, this is years long worth of battles. These guys really hate each other. They're trying to conquer each other to lay claim to the throne. And as part of this process, they reach out to neighboring governments to try to come to their aid for assistance. Now, one of these governments that they both reach out to, independent of one another, is Rome. They reach out to Rome, and they reach out to a guy by the name of Pompey, who's the Roman general at this point in history. So Pompey is coming to Israel to help settle this dispute, or so they think. But instead of helping either one settle this dispute, he lays siege to Jerusalem and takes the whole nation for Rome. So when you fast forward to when we're reading through the whole gospel account and Rome is this power in charge, it's because of this moment in time. These two brothers couldn't get along, so Rome takes Israel for its own. And so this conquest ends the reign of Jewish independence and incorporates Judea as a client kingdom into the Roman Republic. Now, one interesting thing about this is when Rome comes in, they allow Hyrcanus II here to continue in his capacity as the high priest. But he's essentially stripped of all royal titles. He's stripped of all, really any authority to do anything, except for he can continue on as the high priest over Israel. All right, so then we get to 47 BC. Antipater, again, Herod's father, is appointed the first Roman procurator of Judea by Julius Caesar. So I mentioned before, he's one of these guys that his allegiance kind of flows wherever the current powers are. So he buddies up with Julius Caesar and gets himself an appointment of Roman procurator. Now, the Roman procurator, what this was a civilian position, more or less the chief financial officer of the country. And this was a civilian role. If you think over to like Pilate, who's considered like a governor or prefect, that was more of a military role, responsible for civil matters and things like that. So Antipater becomes the guy responsible for financial matters. Long explanation to just say he's responsible for making sure the taxes got collected. So that was his responsibility. So now that Antipater's got a little bit of power, fast forward a couple years, and Herod, his son, is appointed governor over Galilee. This is our first example of Herod really getting some real power. And he uses that power. He's very ruthless in how he rules his area that he's been given. And he's killing a lot of people. He's ruling very ruthlessly. He becomes enemies of the Hasmonean government and of the high priest. But Rome loves this guy. They love him. He's the attack dog that they need to watch over their new people. Then we get to 40 BC, and Herod is appointed king of the Jews. Now, a little bit of backstory here. Herod actually fled his region to go to Rome because in the middle of all this, there was a guy by the name of Antigonus, who was the nephew of Hyrcanus II, and he was making claim to the throne with the help of a neighboring government, the Parthians. So he comes in, they're trying to conquer, and in response to that, Herod just runs away and goes to Rome to visit his friends in Rome. And while he's there, he's reporting all of this that's happening, and Rome is looking at this, and they say, well, you know what we should do is, this is our area. We don't want anyone else to lay claim. We need to name a king. So Herod, how about you take the job? We'll name you king. So with the help of Mark Antony, the Roman Senate names Herod king of the Jews. Now, what's interesting about this is obviously we talked a little bit about his family line. You know, he's not of Jewish birth. He's not of any of those royal line that we talked about last week. And he's in Rome, and he's not expecting this appointment necessarily, but he's given this appointment. And what do you do when you name a new king? What's a new king, president, whatever? What's the immediate reaction? You have a big celebration, right? You have a big feast. So Rome puts on this big feast in honor of the new king of the Jews. So all this stuff's going on, all this partying's going on, and the main course comes out. And what do you think the main course of this feast was? Pork. So Rome names new Herod, this new king of the Jews, and they honor him with a pork feast. You can imagine that the Jews were not overly thrilled with any of this. So again, it's interesting too that this title is King of the Jews, right? And this is going to become important in our story that we talk about today. When the Magi come visit from the east, what do they say when they get to Herod? They say, hey, we're looking for the King of the Jews. You mind pointing us in the right direction? And he's saying, hey, wait a minute, I'm king of the Jews. Rome said so. But we also know this is relevant because when we get to Jesus' crucifixion, what's on the plaque above his head? It says that Jesus is the king of the Jews. So I say all this to say that this title that Herod's been given is a title that was not given to him by any law that was justified by the people that he was governing, but more something that Rome had given him. He wasn't a descendant of the royal line, and because of all that, he was going to be challenged. There was a lot of challengers, Jewish challengers to his lay to the throne. And Herod spent years eradicating people that disagreed with his validity. And that's going to come into play a little bit later as well. All right. So the other set of characters I want to talk about really briefly, and we're still in background mode, so bear with me. But I want to talk about the Magi. So Magi is a transliteration of the word magos. But essentially what it means is it's an astrologer and by implication a magician. And the term is more of a proper noun rather than like an adjective because it was essentially a sacred caste of astrologers from Persia or Babylon. Now, one of the reasons we can infer that is because we actually have a biblical account talking about these guys. And in Daniel chapter 5, if you remember, it's the story of King Belshazzar and the mysterious hand writing on the wall. And in response to that, Belshazzar's mother, the wife of the former king Nebuchadnezzar, she basically says this in Daniel chapter 5, verse 10. She says, "Your father, Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him," talking about Daniel, "appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems." So, and again, a lot of this is theory, so bear with me here, but it's a theory that I really like to think a lot about. So one theory is that these wise men that traveled great distances to come visit the young Jesus could have been descendants of this order of magi that would have been heavily influenced by Daniel. That's a really fun thought in my mind. So you have Daniel who's appointed this role over these these magicians and astrologers and things like that. And what's Daniel going to do? What do we know about Daniel? He's going to influence them. He's going to teach them the things he knows. He's a very godly man. He's going to teach them about the old ways, some of the prophecies there at the time. And it's fun to think that these guys continued that tradition over generations, over generations, over generations. And now all of a sudden we got these magi who are very excited to see the fulfillment of some of these prophecies, and they're there because of that. And again, a lot of that's theory, but I think it's fun to think about. Now, another theory is that these guys could have been Jews who, over time, would have stayed in Babylon after the Babylonian captivity. We do have a lot of record from outside the Bible that it's not like everybody just came back. You had kind of pockets of people who stayed or maybe moved to different places. So it's possible that these would have been from a long line of Jews. Now, we also have a lot of lore about these guys that we sing a lot about during Christmas time. And oftentimes these guys are referred to as the three kings. And three, presumably because that was the number of gifts that were given, right? The gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And I haven't been to a lot of baby showers in my life. Not really my thing. I'll let you ladies do that. But I do know enough about baby showers to know that a lot of you ladies go in halvesies on baby gifts. So it's not uncommon to think that the number of gifts are not always reflective of the number of gift givers. So there's one thing. But it's also very likely that these guys would have traveled in a much larger caravan. It would have been very dangerous, kind of out of the norm for these guys to travel in just a group of three in such a long distance. But what about the reference to them being kings? Does anybody know where that comes from? There's a lot out there, but from what I can tell, this is kind of more or less a reference to Psalm chapter 72. And there's a reference to some kings. Psalm 72 verse 10 says, "May the kings of Tarshish and the distant shores bring tribute to him. May the kings of Sheba and Seba present him gifts. May all kings bow down to him and all nations serve him." I didn't know much about Tarshish before all this. And again, this is Tarshish, not Tarsus. So this isn't talking about where Saul of Tarsus was from. But Tarshish is more or less, at this point in time in the world, was a Phoenician colony off the coast of Spain. So if you know your geography, Spain is not from the east. Spain is literally directly from the west. And also it makes reference to Sheba, which, as we know, is modern-day Ethiopia. It's almost directly south. So this passage that looks very much like a prophecy out of the book of Psalm talks about kings from the west and kings from the south, and that's been kind of conflated to being these magi coming from the east. So that's more or less kind of where we get this concept of them being kings. But what's also interesting is the timing of this whole story. So the context of this story tells us that this is, in fact, a very different account than what Luke's gospel tells us. And in fact, potentially up to 2 years after the actual birth of Jesus. And there's two reasons for that. The first one, in Matthew chapter 2, verse 1, as we start the book, it says, after he was born, in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. So the scriptures very much say that this took place after the birth. Now, for the sake of examples, here's map number 2. And I apologize, that is a lot smaller than I thought it was. But I took the liberty of going to Google to ask Google Maps the distance between ancient Babylon and current day Jerusalem. So for the sake of hypotheticals, let's say these guys traveled from Babylon. As you can see, Babylon is over here. And so I put it into Google Maps, and this is what it spit out. And it says that roughly we're talking about 1,100 kilometers. That's about 700 miles, 680 miles or so, for the sake of our hypothetical. Now, Google says that this would take 254 hours to walk. Now, if you know anything about Google, this is talking a straight shot, no stopping, no stopping for gas, no stopping at Buc-ee's to get your favorite snacks. This is just a straight shot. And 254 hours is about 10 and a half days. So that's a very steady pace. This is roughly the same distance between here and like Kansas City, if anyone's ever walked that. It's about that. Now keep in mind too, this is also using modern day roads. Now, more realistically, these guys would not have traveled directly across this very arid desert plain, right? There's no water. Bandits would have been a significant issue. So if you were going to make a journey like this, typically what you would have done is you would have gone up the Euphrates River right here. Stick along the river line up until you get to this area up here, and then kind of crossing down through modern day Lebanon, which that's going to come up in just a minute as well. But it would have taken you kind of around the desert. Now that path is more like 1,700 miles rather than 700 miles. Now I'm full of comparisons this morning, but for comparisons, the Oregon Trail, remember the Oregon Trail, everybody? For those of my generation, that's a reference to a computer game, not an actual trail. That was my wife, I heard her back there. But the Oregon Trail was about 2,000 miles. So that's from Independence, Missouri, all the way to Oregon. And we have a lot of journal accounts of these guys who made this journey with their wagons, with their oxen, very slow, steady pace. And it would take them on average to travel those 2,000 miles about 4 to 5 months. That's about 15 to 20 miles travel time per day. So it's very likely that it took these guys a long time. I say all that to say it just took a long time for them to get to Jerusalem. And it was also pretty likely that this could have been well up to potentially even 2 years after Jesus' actual birth because of what Herod does in response to all this. And we mentioned it before, but in Matthew chapter 2, verse 16, he gives this order to kill all the baby boys under the age of 2. If this was something that had literally just happened, why issue a decree to cover such a range? And it's thought that this is not information that he got immediately. And so in response to that, he gave a 2-year time frame rather than all the baby boys under 6 months. All right. That is the background. Let's get into the actual text now. So Matthew chapter 2, we're going to start in verse 1 here. And we're going to read through this with a couple pit stops here. So Matthew chapter 2, starting verse 1, it says, "After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, 'Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him.'" So again, we made reference before, these guys are showing up at Herod's door and they're like, "Hey, where's the King of the Jews?" And Herod's kind of looking around, he's saying, "You're talking to him." This would have something that would have highly offended him. But one of the questions that I think about when we're talking about this is, what is the nature of the star? Stars, you're gonna find in this particular story, the star is acting a little bit strange. It's not acting like a normal star. And I have a tendency, this is a fault of mine, I have a tendency when I read through Scripture and we're talking about supernatural things, I want to know, well, how? How did God do this? What are the physics behind it? But we know that's not necessarily of importance. But it's funny, we talked about these guys being magi. Potentially they were probably astrologers. They would have known what stars looked like. Some people have, they don't like to believe that this was kind of a supernatural event. So they'll say, well, maybe Jupiter was shining extra bright that night, because Jupiter is often associated with the birth of kings. Some people will say, well, it was probably a comet and it was acting kind of funny, acting erratically. But regardless of what was actually happening, what's interesting, or the most interesting thing to me, is how did the Magi connect the fact that star meant Messiah had been born. And that's one of the questions on my list of things I want to ask one day. Now, there's a lot of potential explanations for that. I think the most kind of likely explanation is they were just given a special revelation from God. We know that at the end of this story, which we're going to talk a little bit about, a message from God comes to these guys, and the message says, don't go back the same way, go a different way, so you don't run into Herod. So it's very likely that they were given some form of special revelation. All right, into verse 3. It says, when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. So as we talked, Herod's not liking this news that he's receiving. And he's doing a similar, we talked a little bit last week, this analysis that has to be done. If the Jews were going to believe that Jesus was in fact the Messiah that had been prophesied about, certain prerequisites would have to be met, right? And so I think Herod's doing a very similar analysis. It's like, well, these people are coming. They're saying the Messiah's been born. What do the scriptures say about this? And it's pretty likely that Herod would have been well educated in all this. Again, he was born into the customs of the Jews. He wasn't necessarily by blood of Jewish descent, but he would have studied very heavily in this stuff. But he's going to his chief priests to ask them what the prophecies say. And you have to imagine the things going through Herod's brain at this moment. So put yourself in Herod's shoes or his sandals for a minute, and try to think through all the things that he's probably thinking about. So he already knows that his claim to the throne, his title, King of the Jews, is a little bit shaky. His claim to the throne is only as good as Rome says it is. So if Rome decides to come back tomorrow and say, we want somebody else, he's done. He also knows that, he spent years and years and years eradicating all these people that question his claim. But what happens if this kind of theory gets picked up and as people start to believe it? He could have an uprising on his hands. He could be in a difficult spot. So he's going to his chief priests and asking them to verify whether or not those prophecy prerequisites are being met. But the thing that I think is really kind of noteworthy in this passage of Scripture is we don't really get a lot of information about how the chief priests responded to this news. I didn't turn my phone off, excuse me. So we don't get their perspective on this. Imagine you're a chief priest, or you're somebody who has dedicated your life to studying the Scriptures and dedicating your life to God, and these magi from the east say, we followed a star, and a star told us that the Messiah has been born. Don't you think that they'd be pretty excited about this? Don't you think that they would be at least interested enough to go investigate it? Now, we don't necessarily know that they didn't, but the Scriptures don't make it a note to say that they did. And I do think that's probably noteworthy. They knew the Scriptures well enough, so this prophecy, they're making a reference here in Matthew chapter 2, verse 6. That's a reference to Micah chapter 5. So they were very well aware of the prophecy, but you would think that they would have a much higher degree of finding out more. So then we get to verse 7. It says, then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. Verse 8 says, he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I may too go and worship him. So Herod's being a little bit sneaky about this, right? Obviously, he doesn't have any intention on going to worship the newborn Messiah. But he's telling them to go investigate and come report back to me and let me know. Now, this conversation between the Magi and Herod is taking place where? In Jerusalem, all right? Now, he's telling them to go to Bethlehem. So how far away is Bethlehem from Jerusalem? 5 miles, 6 miles. It's roughly the exact same distance between here and like the mall, okay, just for reference. Not very far. So he's telling these guys, go investigate, find out more, come let me know, because I have an interest in coming to worship him. Then we get into verse 9, and it says, after they had heard King Herod, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. Again, stars don't usually do that. I've never seen a star do that. But it's almost like ancient GPS. They had a direction, they were following where the star was taking them, and that's the direction they're going. Kind of reminds me a little bit of when the Israelites are leaving Egypt, right? And they're being led by this pillar of cloud in the day and the pillar of smoke or pillar of fire at night. A lot of makes me think of that. So then verse 10 says, when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country another route. So again, this is the reference we talked about earlier, how they were warned in a dream not to return the same way. But the scriptures say that they visited Mary and the child in a house. It doesn't say they visited him in a stable. It doesn't say they visited, can't get that out, visited him in a cave. It says they visited him in a house. And the Greek word that's used here is the word oikia, which means, the definition doesn't help a whole lot, but it means a house or a dwelling. But the implication of that word is it's more of a permanent dwelling. So not necessarily saying they had bought property there, but it was more of a long-term dwelling situation. And again, I said the word here was oikia. If any of you are yogurt enthusiasts, some of you may buy oikos, which more or less means like family, generations, things like that. It comes from the same word here. But then we get to the Magi coming to visit and presenting gifts. Now, how many Magi were there? We don't know. Most people will say 3. Again, kind of the thought behind that is that was the number of gifts that were given. But let's talk about these gifts for a minute. We have gold, we have frankincense, and we have myrrh. What is gold? Trick question. We all know what gold is. Very valuable, would be worth presenting as a gift. But the lesser items here are frankincense and myrrh. So frankincense, what is frankincense? Besides being a word that's just fun to say, what is frankincense? Anybody know what frankincense is? So it's this aromatic resin, smells good. It was used in perfumes, used for incense. Excuse me? For healing as well. Frankincense comes from what's called a basilia tree. And it's typically found in tropical areas. Now, I don't tell you all that to make you convinced that I'm a botanist, but I tell you that to say that something like frankincense would have had value because it would have had to have come from somewhere else. This is a tree that's very typical to tropical areas, could have come from like the northern Africas. More than likely it would have come from somewhere far off in like Asia or something like that. But the word frankincense in the Greek is the word libanos. And that sounds very similar to a neighboring country that we're familiar with today because it's a cognate of the word Lebanon. If you're familiar with a cognate, it shares the same Greek roots. So the word libanos shares the same root as the country Lebanon. And if you remember when we were talking with that map up there, potentially why it would have been called this is not because that's where it was coming from, but because it would have had to come from there in order to get to their region. So it would have come from very far off, somewhere else, but in order to hit those spice routes, it would have had to come through Lebanon. So potentially that's why it's called Libanos. But then we have myrrh. And apart from also being a very fun word to say, what is myrrh? Myrrh is again, it's a fragrant sap-like resin, but this is more used for the treatment for medicinal purposes. And also used in, as far as I can tell, still used today in a lot of third world countries. But it's used for the treatment of wounds, management of headaches, inflammation of the joints, parasitic infections, obesity, gastrointestinal diseases, and everything else Google has to say about it. But myrrh, the Greek word that's used here is the word smyrna. And in this iteration of this word, smyrna, now it shows up with some different iterations, but with this iteration, it only shows up 2 times in the New Testament. The first time is in here, in Matthew chapter 2. The second time that it shows up is in John chapter 19, when you have the story of Nicodemus And he brings, it says, 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes for embalming Jesus' body. And because of its medicinal qualities, its antiseptic qualities, it was very frequently used for embalming bodies in this day and age. But I think it's a little bit poetic. I think it's a little bit poetic that you have this word show up two times, once presented to him at his birth and the second time presented to him at his death. Now, for full transparency, for those of you who have read through your English Bibles, it will show up a couple other times. The main one that comes to mind would be in Mark's account of the crucifixion, where it says he's offered wine mixed with myrrh. But that's a different word. There's actually a Greek word, and it's a verb that means to mix with myrrh. They have a special verb for that. So anyways, just for full transparency. But that's gold, that's frankincense, and that's myrrh. And so all these things are presented to a baby. So my question is, why are we giving this stuff to a baby?
I think it was given to his parents because they were going to go to Egypt, and they were items that they could use to buy whatever they needed when they went to Egypt.
Sure, yeah. I like that explanation. For those of you who couldn't hear that, she basically said, God obviously knew that they were going to be, after all this, be going to Egypt. And so these would have things that would have been useful on their journey. Sure, that as well, for sure. I like the thought of a baby being presented with medicine. I'm not a baby shower connoisseur by any means, but I will tell you the next baby shower I go to, I will be wrapping up a bottle of Neosporin. We do have precedent for this. So these are the things that are given to a baby Jesus. All right, so then we get to verse 13. And it says, when they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so it was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. So this has been referred to historically as the massacre of the innocents. Now, the Bible doesn't call it this. This is more or less just a historical name that it's been given. But what's unique about this is the Bible account here in Matthew is the only reference to this official decree by Herod. This is not something that Josephus talks about. This is not something that any other major historians at the time talked about. Which this seems like something Josephus would want to take up, right? This seems like a big enough event that he should mention it. So the question is, why would none of the other historians bring this up? And that has led to a lot of people and a lot of historians looking at this account and saying, well, obviously this is just a fabrication of the Bible. You know, if this was something that actually happened, more of history would have recorded it. But I think it's worth putting this whole concept into a little bit of perspective. So if you were to Google the population of Bethlehem during this time, you're going to get a lot of different answers because they don't know for sure. But the range that I've seen is anywhere between like 300 and 3,000. So we're not talking a huge population of people. So if you were going to issue a decree to kill all the boys under the age of 2 with a population that small, we're not talking about thousands and thousands of boys. We're not talking about hundreds. We're talking a dozen, maybe a couple dozen, something like that. Now, that doesn't erase how egregious and how kind of insane all this is. But on the scale of all the things that Herod did that were terrible and evil, this may not have hit the top 10. I'll just put it that way. So it may not have been a large enough event for Josephus to cover. But also couple that with the infant mortality rate at this day and age was also incredibly high. So a lot of young children didn't always make it. Now, many historians, however, I did say that a lot of historical texts don't reference this account, but a lot of historians, you go listen to them and read them, they will say that this probably did happen. And the reason they'll say that is because they'll note that, yeah, the Bible's the only account that talks about this, but this is something that Herod would have absolutely done. Like, it's well within his wheelhouse of all the other things that the history books say about him. Couple examples. Herod once executed 45 members of the Sanhedrin just because. He had his favorite wife, his first wife, Mariamne, executed. He had 3 of his sons executed on suspicion of treason. And there's a story that Josephus does record that's incredibly interesting, and it's basically Herod is on his deathbed, and he's talking to his sister, and he's about to die, and he's kind of given last-minute orders, and he wants his sister to round up all the Jewish leaders at that time and tell them to go to the Hippodrome because we need to have a meeting. And the plan was, once they got there, just slaughter them all. And the quote that Josephus gives from Herod, he says, "Well, I know that when I die, the Jews are going to rejoice, so I want to give them something to cry about." So that's the guy we're talking about. So just because the history books don't record this, this is absolutely something that Herod would have done. So we just got a few minutes left. I want to talk about just a couple takeaways from this entire story. So the first one is it's incredibly easy for fiction to be taken as fact. We've seen what this story has been turned into over the years, talking about the wise men, there being 3 of them, talking about the wise men visiting Jesus in the stable or where the manger was. We see other examples in the Bible of the fruit in the garden being an apple, Jonah and the whale. There's a lot of things like that. And I want to make the point that details matter. All that stuff matters. One of these days, I think it would be interesting to ask Uzzah whether or not he believes details matter. Go ask Nadab and Abihu, do details matter? Details matter. The second thing is God doesn't always provide the perfect set of circumstances for us to do the work that he's calling for us to do. Of everyone who's ever lived, and this is more of a reference to Luke's account, but of all the people who've ever lived, and I'm going to take Jesus out of this equation, but of all the people who've ever lived, I think you could probably make a good argument that Mary was given the most important job anyone's ever been given. And this was not a volunteer position. This was not something where he went to Mary and says, "Hey, I got this idea. Tell me your thoughts. What do you think about this?" He basically said, "This is what's happening." And you would think, and you can put yourself in her shoes, and you can probably think that if I'm given a job like this, I'm probably going to get some perks. I'm probably going to get the best doctors. I'm probably going to get the best hospitals. I'm probably going to have very comfortable arrangements to do all this. And that was by no means the case. Mary was far from home. She's on the road. They couldn't find a place to stay. Could have been probably in a barn or a cave. Imagine the smell. Imagine how unsanitary it was. It says that he was placed in a manger. What is a manger? Well, this is what we think a manger is. This is what we're told a manger is, right? Very comfortable crib for a baby, but it's a feeding trough. Our Lord and Savior was born and laid in a feeding trough. I can imagine that would be any mother's worst nightmare. But those are the circumstances that she was given. So if you ever find yourself in a position where you're thinking that God's calling you to do something, and you're looking at it and you're saying, well, it doesn't really seem like things are lining up the way I think they need to be lining up. Remember Mary. The third thing is true servants of God come from places where we might not expect. We have a lot of examples in Scripture of guys like this. Some people call them the hidden ones, the people that we don't know a lot about that do amazing and great things for the Lord. Sometimes, on just personal experience here, sometimes we get in this rut that unless they're in light posts, they don't exist, right? Unless they show up in a Church of Christ directory somewhere that we've attended, then they don't exist. But that is by no means the truth. There are Christians all over the world right now and in many places who are doing exactly what we're doing and studying God's Word. And I think that's always helpful to be reminded of. It's also not always those who have the most religious privileges who give Christ the most honor. And I put this up there because of this conversation we had a little bit earlier about the chief priests, right? Of all the people in this story, you would think that the chief priests would be the ones who would have the most enthusiasm to go investigate, to find out more. But as far as we know, they didn't do that. Now again, it doesn't record whether or not they did or did not, but it doesn't record that they did. But instead, it was strangers from a far-off, distant land who came to give Christ the honor that he deserved. And sadly, that's a reality of the world we live in today as well. And the last thing I want to mention is the Magi are an incredibly striking example of faith. They believed in Christ. They had never seen him prior to their journey. When the scribes and the chief priests assumingly were unbelieving, They continued their journey. All they needed to see was Jesus sitting on his mother's knee, and they bowed down and they worshiped him. Obviously, they had the star. That was a rather convincing element, but they didn't need any other teaching to persuade them. And this is the kind of thing that I think God just really delights in. And there's always, we talked a little bit last week that everything in Scripture is there for a reason. Everything is profitable. There's a purpose to it. And it's always funny, this account of all the characters that you really could focus on, it focuses on the Magi. So their example of faith is there for us to look at, to study. And I think every time we read passages like this, it brings glory and honor to God to study those who have exuded tremendous examples of faith. And that's our class for today. I really appreciate it. Next week, we're going to hop into Jesus being tempted in the wilderness. So look forward to seeing you then. Thank you all.